Good evening, everybody. Great to see you. Great to be together. And Rav Meidan has mostly very short essays on this week's Parashah. So we're going to see whether two is a good idea or a bad idea. They're each just a little over 3 pages. So, apropos of the topic of food, they sort of feed into each other. So we'll see what happens. I'm going to share my screen and we will get started. Great. The first of the essays is called The Sale of the Birthright, Al Chova Ba'al Zechut, regarding duty and privilege. And it starts with the story, just a review of the verses of the sale of the birthright. Yaakov cooked up a stew, and Esav came from the field, and he was very tired. And Esav said to Yaakov, pour down my throat this red stuff, because I'm really tired. I'm exhausted, and therefore Esav was called Edom. Yaakov said, sell your birthright to me as day. And Esav said, I'm going to die. What do I need this birthright for? And Yaakov said, swear as day. And Esav swore, seeming to be that the deal was a real deal. And Yaakov and Esav sold his birthright to Yaakov. Yaakov gave Esav bread and this lentil stew. Esav ate, drank, got up, left, and degraded, looked denigratingly upon the birthright. That's the short story towards the very beginning of the parasha. This event, this story in its plain sense, looks unflattering. Bilti machmi, in modern Hebrew, machma'ah is a compliment, unflattering. And I have no idea, just thinking about it now, whether it's machma'ah is related to chem'ah, which is butter. You say, a compliment is to butter somebody up. So I don't know if that's a correct etymology or not, just noticing it. So this unflattering event or story as it pertains to or reflects on Yaakov, our patriarch. Yaakov's sitting cooking in his tent while Esav is out there struggling with the difficulties of the field. Esav arrives tired, and it seems like he's hungry to the point of death. He's famished. Yaakov takes advantage of Esav's despairing or difficult spot that he's in, temporarily, his momentary travail, in order to take the birthright from him. And Esav, in this moment of seeing all his plans fall away from him, is dragged like a blind person. I'm not doing the Hebrew poetry justice here. Is dragged like a blind person after Yaakov's plan and loses his birthright for eternity. Was this really a appropriate becoming kind of deal from Yaakov's side? Rabbi Scott is shaking his head no. And now look, the Torah seems to criticize Esav, right? At the end of the story, it's Esav's degrading treatment of the Bechorah, which is what's commented on. And so it seems like we have to explain some other commentary or interpretation of this whole sale. If on the face of it, if we take the Torah as a fair reader or commenter on the events, and the whole rest of it looks like Yaakov taking advantage, and yet Yosef is the one who emerges as worthy of critique, the story doesn't add up as it appears on the face of it. So, and one of the things I loved about this short essay is both it incorporated commentaries I don't remember having seen, and it did really kind of shed a different light on this story that has lots of implications for birthright stories across the Torah. Not radically new perspective, but really elaborates on a sort of certain kind of kernel of thought that we may already have had. The Ibn Ezra and the Ramban really struggle with this question of how it could be that in the tent of Yitzchak, the son of Abraham, who, had so much possessions and property, there wouldn't be enough food to satisfy the thirst of the hunger of Esav, to the point at which Esav would need to sell his birthright for lentil stew, right? Remember, Esav's not coming to somebody else's home, he's coming back home. So the scenario, if you pause for a moment and reflect on it, right, the scenario seems strange. Why doesn't he just walk past Yaakov and go into the kitchen and get all the other food that's there? I mean, again, we can take it that he's so blinded by his starvation that he can't see past the wonderful smell of the thing that's there. But if he had even a moment's more thought, he should have been able to go get some more food, unless part of what makes the story make more sense, in the plain sense, is that this was all the food that there was, and he was starving, and this was all the food in the house. Right, to the point at which it was necessary for him to sell the birthright for lentil stew. The Ibn Ezra answers, this question by saying that Yitzchak, in fact, had lost all his property. He was poor, and he had no food in his house. This quoting the Ibn Ezra on chapter 25, verse 34, right where our story is quoted from. It says, the people must be puzzled, because didn't Abraham leave a lot of wealth? So much so that they hadn't seen, a person this wealthy. I'm sorry. Okay, and it would be strange to see someone who was so wealthy in his youth become so poor in his older age. But if they had a lot of food in their father's house, and he was respectable in his eyes, then he wouldn't have sold the birthright for lentil stew. So the Ibn Ezra, it's a little bit indirect, but the implication seems to be, as Rav Meidan is interpreting, that the Ibn Ezra sees and understands that while it was a tremendous fall from riches to rags, basically, that is in fact what happened, because again, otherwise the story doesn't make sense. If there had been plenty of food, and the birthright was of some value, he wouldn't have sold it for the lentil stew. It would have just gone to get something else to eat. And so we're forced to conclude that Yitzchak's household had become impoverished. The Ramban, challenges this and rejects the possibility that Yitzchak was, devoid of his possessions. In his opinion, there was food in the house, and in fact, the sale of the birthright came from somewhere else. And the Ramban says, "Aval bazoi habechora le'esav la'achzariyut libo." The birthright was, disgraceful or undesirable to Esav because of or reflecting the cruelty in his heart. What would that mean? So Rav Meidan is going to use this really as the jumping off point for his interpretation. This idea that the distaste for the birthright came from a kind of a position of cruelty. What's the cruelty? So Rav Meidan says, seems like we can offer a sort of in-between position a little bit, in between Ibn Ezra and Ramban, if we assume ein mukdam u'muchar b'Torah, that the events and I think it was it Rav Heshi Rabinowitz who was here a while back, and he really went to town on suggesting this without a basis. So we know that there should be some grounds for suggesting that events are not in the order that they're presented in the Torah, but this Rav Meidan is going to utilize this interpretive tool and suggest that this is the case. If we're willing to assume that things are not necessarily exactly in the order that they're presented in the Torah, we have another possible interpretation. The event of the sale of the birthright is told immediately after the birth of the twins, in order to express the connection between this story and the kind of struggle that they had from their very birth, right? That Yaakov came out with his hand grabbing the heel of Esav, meaning there was a conflict from the very birth, and now we jump ahead to tell a story which is out of order because we want to make this thematic link. Rav Meidan has done this before, because we want to make this thematic link and say, see that story, that birth story of conflict plays out all the way through their adulthood. A while hence, we see them continuing to struggle, like in the story of the sale of the birthright. For a little clarification, right? So here we are in chapter 25. We've got the, Rivka's childlessness, her pregnancy after she seeks out God to understand what's going on. She gives birth and there are twins, and the story of grabbing the heel, and then they grow up, and we find out a little bit more about each of them, and immediately jump into this story. And only at the end of that story, with the degradation of the birthright, chapter 26 begins, and we're told Vayira ba'aretz, there was a famine in the land. Aside from the previous one in Abraham's days, and Yitzchak went to Avimelech, the king of Plishtim and Gerar, and the story unfolds from there. So what Rav Meidan is essentially suggesting is what happens at the end of chapter 25, the birthright story, happens after, as he's about to say, the famine story. Okay, so then why is it out of order? Again, because we want to link the birth story to the birthright story, because they are a continuation of the struggle between Yaakov and Esav. But chronologically, that's a thematic continuation. Chronologically, what happens in that story is after at least the beginning of chapter 26 with the famine, as he's now going to explain, right? So with this linking of the birth story and the birthright story, it seems that the background for the sale of the birthright is what comes after and is something different. And that is the beginning of the next chapter. There was a famine in the land, and Yitzchak goes to Abimelech, the king of Plishtim in Gerar. We don't know how many years that famine was in the land until the point at which Yitzchak then wanted to go down to Egypt, and remains in the land of the Plishtim at God's command. That was the next couple of psukim. We don't know how severe those years of famine were. Maybe it was a famine as harsh as in the days of Eliyahu, in the one in which the woman from Tzofat, Asher Letzidon, says, to Eliyahu, as your God lives, if I have even just this little bit of flour and a little bit of oil, I'm going to, gather a few sticks, make that all into a tiny bit to eat, and we will eat it and die, right? This, very, very last morsels of what's left in the cupboard, pardon that slightly loose and non-literal translation. Right, that is a desperate famine where people are literally starving. So we have biblical precedent for such famines. Maybe it was a famine like that. And indeed, even if the Ramban is right that Yitzchak didn't lose all of his property, it's possible that the situation in the land got to the point of such a dire famine that it was near death. Meaning, we can understand also situation where people have possessions doesn't mean they have food, right? They still could have some wealth, but if there's no food to get from anywhere, there's no food to get from anywhere. And so that might have been the scenario where we don't have to say this thing that would seem strange to us, that Yitzchak, after all the possessions that Abraham had and that Yitzchak had amassed, that suddenly they ran out of everything. But maybe they still had some possessions, but the famine was so severe. In Yitzchak's tent, in those years, there was such little to eat that there was rationing. Everybody got these equal portions, and everyone had to preserve their portion and eat it, with foresight and preservation and and care. Just like Bnei Yisrael ate in the wilderness, Omer la Gulgolet, a fixed amount, an Omer of man for every, by every head. Yaakov cooked his portion, in this time of famine, whereas Esav had kind of wasted away everything he was eating and hadn't kept aside something for when things got really bad. On this particular day being described in our Parashah, Yaakov gave up his portion, even as hungry as as he was, in order to get the Bechorah. Right. So we're just describing a different situation by reordering things. That it was a famine. Everybody was on limited rations. Esav, slightly more impulsive person that we're imagining him characteristically to be, kind of used up his portion quickly. Yaakov had what little he had, And on that day, with Esav in the even more dire straits, but Yaakov struggling too, Yaakov was willing to forego it to get the birthright. It's possible that a similar picture stood before the Midrash, which described, after the passage of time, the offspring, the future descendants of the both of them, Mordechai HaYehudi, the descendant of Yaakov, and Haman, the descendant of Esav. We know Esav, Amalek comes from Esav, and Haman comes from Amalek. So we have this chain. The two of them, and we actually saw this midrash when we did Rav Meidan on Megillat Esther, I believe. The two of them were soldiers in Achashverosh's war against his enemies. Mordechai preserved his soldier's ration at a time of difficulty in the war and gave it to Haman, whereas Haman had wasted away his bread, kind of not being forethinking and planful. Mordechai then bought Haman as a slave for that bread. Mordechai had some left, Haman didn't. Haman was desperate, and Mordechai said, I'll give you my bread, but you will become my slave. And at the point at which Haman became appointed to be the head of all of Achashverosh's sarim, whatever officers, viziers, he wanted to deny the fact that Mordechai had bought him as a slave. And that was the explanation for this sort of special hatred that Haman had for Mordechai and for his people. It was a hatred that emerged from a awareness of subservience that he had, and a desire to deny that kind of got expressed in hatred. And this story in the Midrash reminds us more than a little of the sale of the birthright in our Parashah. Yaakov gives Esav the little bit that he had in order to save him from from this utter famine. Maybe he even did this on multiple occasions. And in the end of the day, he eventually demanded the Bechorah in exchange for what he had given Esav. So we have almost this sort of, not quite circular sense where Rav Meidan is suggesting, based on this midrash, that this midrash in about Haman and Mordechai imagines that through this midrash we can see that the Chachamim were imagining that what was happening with Haman and Mordechai must have been prefigured in what happened between Yaakov and Esav, and therefore we can imagine that their perspective on the Yaakov and Esav birthright sale was a similar one, that under circumstances of duress, Esav, had even less than Yaakov, and Yaakov ultimately used that, planful consequence privilege to claim something that he wanted from Esav. Okay, second half is of this part is sort of the way of thinking about what the birthright actually was. So the Torah is teaching us in this portion that the Bechorah is not some, kind of blind gift which is given to whoever is born first. How much the more so when the two brothers that would be, vying for it are twins, and the differentiation between their moments of birth, is not years, but literally seconds. The Bechorah is a duty and not a privilege. Bechorah means responsibility. It means the responsibility for the younger brothers and the responsibility for the aging parents. Responsibility is expressed sort of first and foremost in times of crisis, of scarcity. The person who takes the responsibility in the house, or who took the responsibility in the house for food, was Yaakov. In parallel to the obligations or duties of the birthright, Yaakov demanded its benefits for the future. Esav, by contrast, didn't, degraded or didn't take seriously that birthright responsibility, and therefore he lost it, right? So this is a slightly looser reading of the birthright as not just a thing which is handed, but as a set of responsibilities and attendant benefits that come with it. And the responsibility is essentially to provide for the family. And Yaakov was doing that. And so he was sort of the one who was worthy in that sense of the, or it was expressing the birthright responsibilities. Esav didn't take on that duty, even though he was the one who was gifted with the birthright privileges. But Yaakov was expressing the birthright responsibilities. And so he seized the opportunity to take the privileges as well. But in some sense, Rav Medan is sort of hinting it was coming to him because he was doing what the birthright primarily is about, which is taking family responsibility. Regarding this, duty-bound nature of the first of the birthright, we can learn from an additional scriptural portion, which is Exodus chapter 4, when God is telling Moshe before he even goes down to Mitzrayim, I believe, if I remember right, go tell Paro, or maybe it's just when he arrives, and I can't remember. Go tell Paro, so says the Lord, B'ni b'chori Israel, my firstborn, my child Israel, and that this God is saying, Shalach et b'ni v'yavdeni, send forth my child to serve me. Right. So from here we see that bechorah is duty and not only privilege or gift, and therefore the children of Israel who are presented here really for the first time, as a nation, as the firstborn of God, are right juxtaposed to that is the demand that they also serve God. Right, and we sort of see like the privilege of firstbornness is somehow a closeness, a connection, which warrants their liberation, but that liberation is in order to free them to serve. And so seeing Bnei Israel as God's Bechor strengthens that connection that the birthright is about the responsibility to serve. Again, so it's a little bit loose and it's service of God as opposed to service of family, but it's a link nonetheless. The responsibility of the firstborn, or again, the one who has the birthright, is to feed their parents in his own home as they age. And this footnote was quite striking. Rav Medan writes here, a Japanese woman told me in conversation that the firstborns in Japan have difficulty finding life partners, mates, because the women are, very hesitant to marry them because of the clear, almost primary duty that they have as firstborns to provide for their parents in their old age. So just interesting piece of randomly shared data. Again, how wide is that a widespread phenomenon that, cross-cultural? I don't know, but Rav Medan draws on this personal conversation to sort of say, this can be a really, really strong norm, which is potentially life-consuming for a period of time, right? The Torah rewards that with a double portion. The Ramban in our Parashah raises the question whether in the days of the patriarchs that double portion even was given, or whether simply the birthright was the duty, basically just the duty. One way or another, what Yaakov is inheriting, receiving, taking possession of with the giving of that stew was responsibility, not gift. A variation or a form of this, birthright, as it is described here, is what Yosef practiced, who was the firstborn to his mother, and also ultimately receives the birthright in Yaakov's blessings in the end of Yaakov's days, right? When Yaakov says, Ephraim and Menashe, Kiruven, B'Shimon, Yuli, that your children, Ephraim and Menashe, too, will raise, jump up a generation to be of the status of Reuven and Shimon, meaning you get two tribes where everybody else gets one. Yosef becomes Ephraim and Menashe. That's essentially descriptively the birthright. You get two portions. Your two children occupy your spot, and therefore a double portion. At the time when the brothers were going out to shepherd the sheep in faraway Shechem, Yosef remained in Hebron with his father in order to take care of him, nourish him, provide for him in his old age, right? So this links up to, here Rav Meidan's pulling a bunch of things together in just a few, short phrases, links up to the question Ilan happens to be learning the beginning of Parashat Vayeshev in school, and we were looking at these psukim tonight and asking the question, why was Yosef staying at home, right? So one approach is, again, depending on how old you think we know he was 17, at least when he has the dreams, and if the events happen, soon after, so maybe he was staying home because he was young, and Yaakov wanted to keep him close, and he was the favorite son. But Rav Meidan's reading here is, additionally, he was already sort of practicing the birthright role of staying home to nourish and take care of and provide for his father. And again, the sense then is that ultimately then he receives the recognition for that at a later point, but the duty of the Bechorah, in some sense, could almost be taken by anyone, and they ought to then, it seems like, receive the rewards that go with it, but it's not automatic. So maybe there's, sometimes they get it through a blessing, sometimes they have to sort of try to claim it for themselves because it goes along with the responsibility. Indeed, we have to recognize, Rav Meidan concludes, that Esav did continue to bring food to his father. And according to the Ibn Ezra that we mentioned above, he was doing this even in the times of, poverty and famine in Yitzchak's house. So, right, if we're being honest and true to the verses, Esav was also playing a role in nourishing and providing for his father. But in our Parashah, Esav degraded the Bechorah. The additional duties that came along with it, Esav was not fulfilling. The decisive struggle was ultimately, what Yaakov and Esav were ultimately fighting over, with this kind of negotiating about over this lentil stew, was the privilege and the duty to provide for the elder and blind Yitzchak, their father. And it was there then that Yitzchak says about Yaakov, Gam Baruch Yihiyeh, may he be blessed too, after he realizes that Yaakov, took that birthright, or the blessings, may he be blessed too, in a sort of an acknowledgement, in some sense, of Yaakov as the, more attentive, providing child. Okay, I'll pause here. I think we will have time to see the second essay, but pause here for comments. I think there's, again, interesting points. First, Rav Meidan's, his method, which, seems to be we always wonder, where does it start from? Is it an intuitive sense? Is it the midrashim? Is it the questions on the text? But there's this underlying, vision of the story, which is really about, providing for Yaakov, and then that links up to a broader vision of the Bechorah. And it's also interesting because it sort of lays bare I think a very real sibling negotiation in real life about what is the responsibility to care for aging parents, and how does that play out, and what comes along with it, and how it impacts the relationships. So I think that sort of like underlying current is interesting to think about as well. Questions or comments on this one before we try to see a second semi-related one? Dad?
When Esav comes to Yaakov, the Torah describes him as saying, give me this stuff, I want to gulp it down because I'm about to die. And that's pretty much what Yitzchak says to Esav. Go out and kill this animal and give me some venison because I'm about to die. There really is a connection between the two of them. And I don't know if it's just exaggeration or there really is, they have a feeling of their life is limited in some way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Beautiful, nice textual connection. Absolutely. And Rav Meidan is going to relate to that just a little bit, this sort of parallel in the next essay. David L.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it really is beautiful. And the references in his first paragraph to sitting in the tent and to dragging a blind person are just lovely intratextual references. But what I found surprising, I found two things surprising. One, why Ramban and Ibn Ezra have to explain why Esav couldn't go to the refrigerator, when we've just had the story of how much work it was for Sarah to prepare the meals for the Malachim.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the age of fast food or prepared food or refrigeration.
Mm-hmm.
And you could totally see that you come home and it's difficult to turn whatever it is in the house into food. The other piece is that what it seems like Rav Meidan is doing is there is a justification to say that Yaakov is already serving the role of the provider, even though he doesn't have the rights of the provider, and therefore it's really justified for him to take advantage of the situation and take over the legal status. It does sound like the perspective of somebody who has some misgivings about the way certain legal claims are have played out, either in our text or perhaps in his contemporary life. And he says, given the facts on the ground and the way that people were behaving, you just got to wonder whether that's influencing the way he reads this text.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Yes, and I think we, in the complicated cases of real life, we do see sometimes the lead child in caring for a parent may arrogate to themselves certain benefits without consultation, or because I'm functioning as, and so therefore if I siphon this to myself, it goes along, and things get messy in those circumstances. And I think it's really interesting to sort of suggest what worldview he might have that is kind of coloring this reading.
And the last thing that I would just add very quickly is that the disparagement of the birthright is, when you look at it in the context of saying that you have certain obligations, certain financial obligations in life, and is your inheritance, is your double portion going to help you fulfill them or not? If in that context, maybe Esav is saying, I don't need to inherit. I can take care of what I need to take care of by and maybe he's disparaging, especially when you put it together with thinking that perhaps the family wealth has been dissipated during hard times. He says, what? I don't need that.
Yeah. Interesting. Great. Okay. Wonderful. Let's go on to the second. And I'll share my screen again. Okay. Yitzchak's food. Machalo shel Yitzchak. So now we go a couple of chapters forward from the end of chapter 25 to excerpts from chapter 27 as Yitzchak gets ready to offer blessing. And he's speaking to Esav and says, take up your hunting implements, go out to the field and trap some game for me, and make these matamim, these delicacies that I love, bring it to me that I can eat it, so that I can bless you, as my father mentioned here, as my dad Jake mentioned, B'terem amut, before I die. And goes on to say, go to the sheep and now this is Rivka speaking, go to the sheep and take me to good goats from there, and I'll make the delicacies for your father that he loves. you'll bring it to him and he can eat, so that he can bless you before his death. Esav goes, brings it to his mother. She makes the delicacies that Yitzchak loves rather, gives them together with the bread that she made into the hands of Yaakov, her son. Yes, that's Yaakov goes. I don't know if I said Esav before. I always appropriately get it all confused here. And Yaakov said to his father, once now he's arrived, and Yaakov says, "I am Esav, your firstborn. I did what you asked of me. Come and sit down now and eat from the game that I've trapped, so that you can bless me." And Yitzchak says, "Draw near, and I will eat from this game of my son, in order that I can bless you." And he brought it close to him and ate, and brought him wine, and he drank. The tremendous focus of these verses on food and delicacies, and the whole contingency of the blessings for eternity of this nation, which is ultimately going to, rule in the land, being dependent on this question of food and delicacies, can be matrid. How to best translate that here? Like a little tedious, a little, seem pedantic.
Troubling.
Okay, great. All right, thank you. It could be troubling. Matrid. Good. Why is everything dependent on, good food and its taste? More than that, the Torah implicates or criticizes Esav, who sold his birthright and everything which came along with it for lentil stew. Is Yitzchak any better? Right? He's now kind of selling the birthright and the blessing for some delicious meat. Now we get a Rav Meidan, which moves away from kind of textual close reading, and sort of goes a little bit more on a homiletical spiritual plane that we have seen from him sometimes. On occasion he'll quote Hasidic interpretation, and that's what he does here. Again, we'll circle back to some other psukim in Tanakh, but sort of starts with a Hasidic spiritual answer. He says Hasidic texts kind of wrestled with this, and the core of their answer has to do with the desire to kind of affirmative value of bringing the material world closer to the divine. And he quotes from the Sfat Emet on this Parashah, who says that the aspect, the kind of relevant dimension of these physical delicacies, these food delicacies, is the idea of bringing the aspects of this world, material world, close to God. And the more something is distant from God in sort of its natural nature, then the more good and, in a sense, kind of almost easier it is to elevate it to God, because you have a long way to go. So you can really make a lot out of the process of taking things. The more material and physical they are, the more significant the practice of elevating them to connect them to a spiritual realm is. Yitzchak was seeking to elevate these delicacies, physical, food delicacies, and turn them into a part of service of God. How does this desire for food turn into service of God? The deriving benefit, or say pleasure from this world, can be mere hedonism. Maybe that's a good translation here of nehentanut, pleasure, enjoyment, or the practice of pleasure and enjoyment. So pleasure in this world can be, in a negative sense, is liable to be mere hedonism, which is devoid of any notion of kedusha, and that's how it usually is. But it also can become a kind of a delight, a pleasure, an enjoyment, which is me'ein olam haba, which is sort of some taste of the world to come. When a person is, sufficiently aware of the idea that they're actually dependent on the table of their God, so to speak, that everything that they enjoy in this world comes from God, and that the goal of that God is to bring them good and to bring goodness to all of humanity and all of humankind. Just like every hostess rejoices when the guests eat the food, the very good food that she has brought to them. So too, it's good in God's eyes when people take, from the best that this world has to offer, right? So sort of taking this orientation of, God as provider, that's God's goal. And so our enjoyment is a fulfillment of that and connects us to God from God's perspective, and can connect us to God from our perspective if we have that frame of mind. All of this, now Rabbi Dan says that all of this is, true and works as long as the person actually senses themselves as a grateful guest, acknowledging that which their host is providing them, and here the host being God. And so we learn in the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Rabbi Chizkiah in the name of Rabbi Cohen in the name of Rav says, a person is, will be held accountable, will be required to provide an accounting for everything their eyes saw that they didn't eat. Right? It seems like a sort of strange idea. Is it demanding of us to, just be gluttons? No, it's a sense that God provided this world for our enjoyment, and if we didn't, we weren't good guests. We didn't partake of everything that was on the table. This is leveled against me as a vegan, by the way. Sometimes, like, well, you're supposed to eat all of the delicious things that are in God's world that God created for human enjoyment. So that's a challenge. It seems that Yitzchak wants to behave in this sort of way, which is suggested in Kohelet. Now we have an excerpt from Kohelet. What benefit, to the doer in all of their toil? I've seen this, reality which God gave humans to afflict them. God did everything appropriate in its time, and gave them the whole world. I don't know if I'm translating this so well. Maybe hold on. I'm going to jump over to a better translation. Kohelet chapter 3. Second. Nine to 14. Okay. What value can the man of affairs get from what he earns? I have observed the business that God gave man to be concerned with. God brings everything to pass precisely at its time. God also puts eternity in their mind, but without man ever guessing from first to last all the things that God brings to pass. Thus, I realize that the only worthwhile thing there is for them is to enjoy themselves and do what is good in their lifetime. Also, that whenever a man does eat and drink and get enjoyment out of all of his wealth, it is a gift from God. I realize too that whatever God has brought to pass will recur evermore. Nothing can be added and nothing taken. And God has brought to pass that men revere God. The claim is that one should accept all of God's deeds in this world as they are, without an attempt to change them. One can fill the heart with the trust that God did everything in the best possible way, and a person shouldn't try to arrange a whole kind of questioning or analysis about how God decreed that the world should be and how God runs the world. By the way, in the footnote at the beginning of this Kohelet quote, Rav Meidan says, Kohelet has a lot of different frameworks for understanding the world, and the one which is in front of us is not the ultimate conclusion, right? Which is in the end, all there is to do the mitzvot and revere God, which sort of assumes much more of a potentially kind of active role. This is sort of a more passive accept and just utilize and take advantage with recognition that it comes from God of everything which God has put in front of you. Right, that's the Kohelet approach, which is being suggested here, which Rav Meidan is going to suggest Yitzchak sort of embodies. So a person doesn't have a job in the world other than getting benefit from the good which God has, in God's goodness, has put in front of them, and is like a guest in the house of the master, the house of God. And then all of this, enjoyment-based living, this hedonism, is, it's a negative quality when the person sort of feels like they actually want to take responsibility in the world, or when they, try to demand all the things that they think are coming to them. But when they sort of just have this acceptance frame, total trust in God, and then they're prepared to receive God's judgment with a full heart and without, any question, then the pleasure and benefit that they enjoy from God's table can be a positive thing, right? So if you come in with, if you approach the world with this orientation, it is what it is. It's whatever I experience and have in my life is a reflection of God's desire to give me good, and then the enjoyment of it, not as a desire to grab more than your share or anything else, is a good thing. It's just the guest being thankful, accepting what's been put in front of them, and recognizing the generosity of the host. Esav kind of claims, demands, and takes things for himself. That is the negative, hedonistic approach. Yitzchak, by contrast, accepts God's judgment in every place with love, as we're going to explain a little bit later. Yitzchak represents the attribute of din, of sort of strict justice or judgment, meaning acceptance of God's judgment. A person who lives in the world of accepting God's judgment can eat from God's table and enjoy that, take pleasure from that. As we said, this attribute of accepting judgment characterizes Yitzchak. And it seems that this is sort of the meaning of his response to the bracha, that he gave Yaakov once he realized that bracha came to Yaakov through deceit. Yitzchak trembled a very great trembling, and said, "Who is the one who trapped this game and brought it for me that I could eat from all of it? Before he will come and I will bless him." This one too should be blessed in this sort of position of acceptance. Last section. Rav Meidan will try to tie all of this together. Now he's quoting from that last phrase, Gam Baruch Yihyeh, may this one be blessed, meaning after acknowledging that it was Yaakov who was deceitful and got the blessing, and he says, let him be blessed too. So Rav Meidan asks, why didn't Yitzchak go back? Now he's sort of going to, this is in certain sense all a build up to this question he wants to ask. Why didn't Yitzchak, retract the blessing to Yaakov, knowing that it was given, under false pretenses with a, misrepresentation? If Yitzchak really trembled, why does he then immediately say, Gam Baruch Yihyeh, right? The pasuk seems strange. He's trembling, like, how could this have happened? Why doesn't he then go on to say, we have to reevaluate the situation? He trembles, and then he accepts. As we said, Yitzchak saw himself as a guest in the world. He saw everything in everything that happened, God's action, and it's not appropriate for the guest to, make it level some forcible claim against the host that the host should have behaved differently. Not only that, in the chapter that pertained to the Avram's servant taking an oath in the Parashah of Chayei Sarah, we wrote that in a particular way, Yitzchak, in a certain sense, Yitzchak remains bound on the altar, right? Yitzchak post Akedah sort of remains this bound, constrained, acted upon figure. That idea that we developed in that essay in Chayei Sarah, one we have not seen, links also to our idea here. The Zohar, Hakadosh, and the wise sages of Kabbalah saw Abraham as a representative of this attribute of Chesed, and Yitzchak as a representative of the more harsh attribute of judgment, of Din. Abraham, who represents Chesed, behaved with God's creatures in Chesed, and that was, his praise. Yitzchak, who's the representative of Din, did he act with God's creations with Din, and would that be his praise? No, Yitzchak didn't act with God's creations with Din. Yitzchak's link to the attribute of Din doesn't come to its expression in his active interactions, but rather in the way he accepts God's judgment and sees everything that happens as God's ruling, which is incumbent upon him to accept. He accepts the knife upon his neck at the time of the Akedah. He accepts the woman that God designates for him through Eliezer, and he accepts the banishment that the Plishtim, banish him from the wells which he dug. In our Parashah too, Yitzchak accepts the deception that Rivka and Yaakov brought to bear against him in the portion of these blessings, and doesn't question. He sees in all of this the will of God, and on the fact that he was deceived, he says nothing other than Gam Baruch Yihiyeh. So we sort of have these two, I think, kind of two halves of the story. The first half being this essay. The first half being the question of kind of what's the role of all the food. It seems like such a material thing, and how are blessings all attached to this? And Ramadan tries to answer that by developing this idea that food is about somehow elevating the material to the spiritual, and the sort of framework that he builds for that happening is kind of seeing, is this kind of both literal and almost metaphorical idea of seeing yourself as a guest at the table, and the food as enjoyment of this world fits in the framework. The way to create a spiritual framework out of that is to sort of see everything that you get in this world as a gift, because you are a guest in God's world and you accept it as it is, and that is Yitzchak's character. And that's sort of why the whole framework of the blessings is built around this idea of enjoying the food, because that simple thing is characteristic of Yitzchak's way in the world. I'm here, I accept what God gives me, I'm grateful for it, and that's all the way down to just the food on the table. And that's not something to be, and I think this is the sort of almost the crux of the point for Medad. This is not everybody's orientation. This is not the ultimate orientation of Kohelet. This is a kind of way of being in the world, and our inclination to be critical of it, we have to be a little bit self-critical of that inclination and recognize that it's coherent, within a system that sort of just, approaches with acceptance. In that system, then kind of enjoyment in the world is not hedonistic. Trying to sort of grab things which aren't ours, or doing things without recognition of God as the giver, that's problematic. But eating and enjoying in the framework of this is what God has to offer and I accept it, has some internal coherence. And again, it's always in contrast with something else. So this is sort of Yitzchak, for whom this makes sense because he's the passive character. But I think Ramadan certainly is leaving us, or I certainly feel compelled to say, this is not necessarily the ultimate praiseworthy approach. I think Ramadan is trying to just like put all the pieces together to make it a coherent approach. But it stands in contrast to the person who, in relationship with God, is much more active. The Abraham who's claiming and demanding and questioning God's justice. It's also in relationship with God, and it's motivated by Chesed, and in that context, it shouldn't be criticized either. And they're just sort of different characters and different, overall approaches. I almost feel like it's, if I'm editorializing for a moment, it feels because it's all for the good, and we just accept what comes to us. at least at some level, is not a kind of philosophical outlook which I share. I certainly share at least a part of the Avraham quality, even if sometimes in the end, what can we do but accept in certain moments? But so I don't know whether how much this reflects Rav Meidan's approach, or how much it's an attempt to kind of justify an approach that he might see out there in the world, and create a box or a container for it. Lance, go ahead.
Okay, we have Jacob in the ladder, we have Jacob at the birthright, we have Jacob and the trickster, we have Jacob with the angel, we have Jacob at the end with Esau at the funeral. These are totally different characters. If you think about Elisha is someone who regenerates a child. Elisha is someone who curses children. I mean, to me, these are totally radically different characters. There's absolutely no coherence here. There is no consistency because you're dealing with an ancient approach to literature, and it's not psychological. I mean, what you're looking for is, a psychological novel where you have a character. Trying to think of, you can think of think of a Music Man or something like that, where the Music Man is basically the same character throughout. And here you're dealing with an incredible contradiction, conflict. And I think that's part of the problem of, everything that we're reading and thinking about here is coming from a position that is untenable, as far as I'm concerned. It's not that I don't love it, not that I don't think God wrote it. I do, but I just don't think that we can take 20th century or 21st century literary critical approaches to, or even, earlier, even Talmudic approaches to a text that is so foreign, so radically different. And if you remember, Eric Auerbach in Mimesis compares Genesis with the Odyssey. And there is absolutely, they're totally different approaches. The Odyssey deals with detail and detail of the gods and everything. And Genesis, there are holes, there are mysteries all over the place. God appears. Where is he? Where is Abraham? We don't know. I mean, it's totally radically different. And I appreciate, what everybody's trying to do here, but as someone who comes at it from a radically, totally different perspective, I think, I don't get it, sort of, I mean, I think, for example, the story with the birthright, to me, compared with the story of the blessing, is radically totally different. You have a woman in charge, you have a trickster, okay? And on the other story, you have Jacob is alone. There is no one monitoring him. Esau comes in. It makes absolutely no sense. As you said before, what's this? Doesn't add up. Doesn't add up. But one way of looking at it would be that the story of the birthright and a story of the blessing are are drafts. And I think the story of the blessing works much better than the story of the birthright. And I think that you're talking about situations where people are writing and rewriting texts over and over again until they get it right.
Interesting. Thank you. And it's interesting to me in light of what you said, because I think that Yitzchak is being presented as by Rav Meidan, at least, as a coherent character, right? As maybe not such a multi-dimensional character, in contrast to the way you're describing the many Yitzchaks, the many Yaakovs, the many Elishas. Like, Yitzchak does seem to be, a kind of relatively consistently passive character. So his personality, as presented in the Torah, at least, seems to be a little bit more naturally coherent and consistent. Any other thoughts, comments? Dad, great.
The phrase that, I don't remember who said it or where it was written, that Yitzchak was still bound on the altar.
Mm-hmm.
I'm guessing that person meant it was as if he were still bound on the altar. Yet,
Yes. Yes.
Um,
Yes.
When after the Akedah, Avraham leaves with his two servants.
Yeah.
No mention of Yitzhak.
Yeah.
Maybe he was still bound on the altar.
Yes. Yes. I mean, he winds up doing some stuff in the story later on, but I think it's very significant. And I think it was Professor Adiel Schremer when he was in the Bayit a bunch of years ago, was the first person from whom I learned this tradition of, and I'm trying to remember who else made reference to it. It might have been Rav Meidan somewhere else, and he says that he talks about this more in Chayei Sarah. This idea of, and maybe I'm trying to think if he alluded to it in I think what we saw last week. This idea of there is a tradition in which Yitzchak is understood to have remained bound and even been sacrificed, right? You have medieval piyutim, especially in communities that were, that had martyrs, where they look to Yitzchak as the sort of role model. And so they talk about the ashes of Yitzchak on the altar. So there is, there are these little textual cues, and then there's a more expansive development midrashically and in piyut of this, this particular strand. It's funny, you have, on the one hand, you have Yaakov, you have this notion Yaakov Avinu lo mate, right? He never died. And then in the other direction with Yitzchak, you sort of have the sense like he actually died, even though we know from later on in the story that he didn't die. So you have these kind of divergent, I think it's reflective of the kind of taking to the extremes the sense of their personalities, that Yitzchak is ultimately very, very passive and acted upon, and Yaakov is much more, active and filled with progeny and ongoing legacy, and Yitzchak is more towards constraining and passivity.
So, as a Christological reference, Yitzchak did die, and he was resurrected.
Okay, right. I don't know whether that gets picked up in. I have no idea whether in Christianity there's development of that idea or not. I saw a really I saw a really off-color Jewish comedian, some clips on YouTube, just as an aside, and he says, he says a ridiculous thing that Jews were there. There's just one kind of Jew. I don't know how in the world he could say such a thing. He says, but Christian denominations, there's so many, and what are they really disagreeing on? Like, how many inches up his back Jesus was carrying the cross? There are all these ridiculous disagreements. It was just funny to me because I feel like I would say the same thing about Jews relative to Christians. But yeah, so I don't know whether there is picking up of that story of the binding of Isaac in Christian writings. Good question. Lance, one more thought?
Okay, my thought here is, in the story of Jacob and Joseph, I don't see Jacob as active or anything. I mean, he is as passive as you're saying Isaac is. And that just figures into my point. If you take these things in a very narrow way, you could talk about them. You have no problem talking about them. I have no problem talking about them. But when you begin to make generalizations about these characters, I have a problem.
Yeah, I hear you. It's a fair critique on Yaakov's persona. I think that's true. He certainly has times of, with Dinah and Shem, where he's just quiet, with Yosef and the dreams, where he's just quiet. So yes, I agree that, there are ways where he's more like Yitzchak in that sense. Absolutely. All right. Great to learn together, and we'll continue on next week. Thanks, everybody. Take good care. Good night. Love to mom and dad. To all.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night, Ruth. Great to hear your voice.
Thank you.